The storm that would change everything began as little more than dark clouds gathering on the horizon of the Yorkshire countryside. Lady Emma Hartwell, daughter of the late Earl of Thornfield, stood at the window of the servants' quarters at Ravenshollow Estate, watching the ominous sky with growing unease. 6 months ago, she had been living in luxury as the cherished daughter of nobility. Now stripped of title and fortune by her stepmother's machinations, she worked as a stable hand under an assumed name, her delicate hands calloused from mucking stalls and her once pristine gowns replaced by rough work clothes. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had once owned some of the finest horses in England, now cared for the magnificent animals belonging to Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow. He was a man she had admired from afar during her days in society, tall, commanding, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. He was known throughout England not only for his vast wealth and political influence, but for his legendary stable of Arabian horses, the finest bloodstock in the kingdom. Emma had taken the position at Ravenshollow out of desperation, using the name Mary Fletcher, and claiming to be the daughter of a deceased stablemaster. Her knowledge of horses, gained through years of passionate study and breeding, had secured her the job, despite the head groom's initial skepticism about hiring a woman. What she hadn't expected was to find herself falling in love, not just with the magnificent animals in her care, but with the man who owned them even though he barely knew she existed. The Duke saw her only as one of many servants, a quiet girl who had an unusual way with horses but was otherwise unremarkable. He had no idea that the woman mucking out his stalls had once danced with princes, spoken 4 languages fluently, and managed an estate worth thousands of pounds. To him, she was simply Mary Fletcher, a competent stable hand who kept to herself and did her work without complaint. But on this October evening in 1823, as the storm clouds gathered with unprecedented fury, Emma would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from the most unexpected places. In the space of a few terrifying hours, she would risk everything to save what the Duke treasured most, and in doing so, would reveal not only her true nature, but also the depths of her feelings for a man who had never truly seen her. The storm would strip away all pretenses, all social barriers, all the careful walls she had built around her heart. And when the thunder faded and the rain stopped, the Duke would look at his humble stable hand and see not just a servant, but a miracle, a woman whose courage and love would transform his understanding of what truly mattered in life. Follow this tale of hidden identity and unexpected love, where a storm becomes the catalyst for a romance that defies all social conventions, and where true nobility is measured not by birth, but by the courage to risk everything for those we love. Emma had been working at Ravenshollow for nearly 6 months when she first noticed the signs that this storm would be different from any other. The horses sensed it first, as they always did, their ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as they caught scents carried on the wind that human senses couldn't detect. The magnificent Arabian stallion Midnight, the Duke's prized breeding horse worth more than most men earned in a lifetime, paced restlessly in his stall, his black coat gleaming with nervous sweat. "Easy, boy," Emma murmured, running her hand along his powerful neck. The horse calmed at her touch, as they all did. It was a gift she had possessed since childhood, an intuitive understanding of these noble creatures that went beyond mere training or experience. "I know you're worried. I can feel it too. I can." The transformation from Lady Emma Hartwell to Mary Fletcher had been both the most terrifying and liberating experience of her life. 6 months ago, she had been living in the elegant comfort of Thornfield Manor, surrounded by servants who catered to her every need, wearing gowns that cost more than most people earned in a year, and managing her father's extensive horse breeding operation with the confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege and education. Her father, the Earl of Thornfield, had been an extraordinary man who had recognized and nurtured his daughter's unusual passion for horses. While other fathers of his station might have discouraged such interests as unladylike, the Earl had encouraged Emma's studies in equine breeding, anatomy, and bloodlines. He had even allowed her to correspond with horse breeders across Europe, building a network of knowledge and contacts that was unprecedented for a woman of her age and station. "Emma, my dear," he had often said, watching her work with their prize stallions and mares, "you have a gift that transcends gender or social convention. These animals respond to you in ways I've never seen. Don't let anyone convince you that your passion is inappropriate simply because you're a woman." Under his guidance, Emma had developed the Thornfield breeding program into one of the most respected in England. She had studied bloodlines going back generations, analyzed the genetic traits that produced the finest horses, and personally overseen the breeding of animals that had won races and competitions across the continent. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, her instincts unerring, and her reputation among serious horsemen was beginning to rival that of the most established breeders in the country. All of that had ended with her father's sudden death from a fever that had swept through the county. Within days of his funeral, Emma's world had crumbled around her. Her stepmother, Constance, had revealed her true nature, cold, calculating, and utterly without affection for the stepdaughter, who had always been closer to the Earl than she had ever been. "My dear Emma," Constance had said with false sweetness as they sat in the drawing-room of Thornfield Manor, "I'm afraid there have been some changes to your father's will. It seems that in his final illness he recognized the need to ensure that the estate would be properly managed by someone with the necessary experience." Emma had stared at her stepmother in confusion. "I don't understand. Father always said that I would inherit Thornfield, that I would continue the breeding program he started." "Yes, well, men often make promises they cannot keep," Constance had replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "The reality is that the estate requires a man's guidance. I have arranged a marriage for you with Lord Reginald Blackthorne. He is a man of substantial means and considerable experience in estate management." The name had sent a chill down Emma's spine. Lord Blackthorne was a man in his 50s, known throughout society for his cruelty to both animals and servants. His first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, and rumors persisted that he had beaten her regularly before her untimely death. The thought of being married to such a man, of being subject to his authority and his appetites, had filled Emma with horror. "I won't marry him," she had said firmly. "Father would never have wanted me to marry such a man." "Your father is dead," Constance had replied coldly, "and you are now my responsibility. You will marry Lord Blackthorne, or you will find yourself with no home, no income, and no prospects. The choice is yours." Emma had soon discovered that her stepmother's threats were not idle. The Earl's will had indeed been altered in his final days, whether through coercion, deception, or simple manipulation of a sick man's confused state. Emma would never know. But the result was clear. Constance inherited everything, while Emma was left with nothing but a small annuity that would barely keep her in modest comfort. Faced with the choice between a marriage that would destroy her soul and striking out on her own with nothing but her wits and her knowledge of horses, Emma had chosen freedom. She had fled Thornfield Manor in the dead of night, taking only a small bag of belongings and the few pieces of jewelry she could carry. The transformation from Lady Emma Hartwell to Mary Fletcher had been accomplished with the help of a sympathetic maid who had provided her with servants' clothes and helped her create a believable backstory. Now, 6 months later, Emma had built a new life for herself at Ravenshollow. It was a hard life, filled with physical labor and constant vigilance to maintain her disguise, but it was her own. She had found purpose in caring for the Duke's magnificent horses, satisfaction in using her knowledge and skills, even if she could never receive credit for them, and a kind of peace in the simple rhythms of stable life. The other stable hands had initially been skeptical of the quiet young woman who claimed to be the daughter of a deceased stablemaster, but Emma's obvious competence had gradually won their acceptance. She worked harder than anyone, never complained about the most menial tasks, and had an uncanny ability to calm even the most fractious horses. Thomas Whitmore, the head groom, had come to rely on her judgment and expertise, though he sometimes wondered about the depth of knowledge she displayed. "Mary," he had said to her one day as they watched her work with a young colt who had been giving the other handlers trouble, "where exactly did your father work? I've been around horses all my life, and I've never seen anyone with your instincts." Emma had deflected the question with a vague reference to various estates where her fictional father had supposedly worked, but she could see the curiosity in Thomas's eyes. She would have to be more careful about displaying too much knowledge, lest she arouse suspicions that could lead to her discovery. The Duke himself was both the greatest joy and the greatest torment of her new life. Adrian Blackwood was everything she had remembered from her days in society and more. He was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of natural authority that came from generations of noble breeding. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes impeccably tailored, and his bearing that of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. But it was his gentleness with the horses that had first captured Emma's heart. She had observed him during his daily visits to the stables, noting how he spoke to each animal individually, how he remembered their quirks and preferences, how his eyes lit up with genuine affection when he looked at his beloved horses. This was not the casual interest of a wealthy man in an expensive hobby. This was the deep, abiding passion of someone who truly understood and loved these magnificent creatures. Emma had been careful to remain invisible during these visits, keeping to the background and focusing on her work, while the Duke inspected his horses and consulted with Thomas about breeding plans and training schedules. She had no desire to draw attention to herself, knowing that closer scrutiny might reveal inconsistencies in her carefully constructed false identity. But sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would allow herself to study his face, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he touched the horses' necks and shoulders. She had fallen in love with him gradually, helplessly, knowing that her feelings were both hopeless and dangerous. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. As Lady Emma Hartwell, she might have been considered a suitable match for the Duke. They moved in the same social circles, shared the same interests, and her father's estate, while not as grand as Ravenshollow, had been respectable enough to make such a union possible. But as Mary Fletcher, stable hand, she was so far beneath his notice that she might as well have been invisible. The other servants at Ravenshollow were kind enough, though Emma was careful to maintain a certain distance to avoid questions about her past. There was Sarah Mills, the head housemaid, a cheerful woman in her 30s who had taken Emma under her wing when she first arrived. There was William Thornton, the butler, a dignified man who ran the household with military precision. And there were dozens of others, footmen, kitchen maids, gardeners, grooms, all part of the vast machinery that kept a great estate functioning. Emma had learned to navigate the complex hierarchy of servant life, understanding her place in the pecking order and the unwritten rules that governed interactions between different levels of staff. It was a world she had never imagined she would inhabit, but she had adapted with the same determination that had helped her master the intricacies of horse breeding. The work itself was physically demanding, but satisfying. Emma rose before dawn each day to begin the morning feeding, mucking out stalls, grooming horses, and preparing them for exercise or training. Her hands, once soft and white, had become calloused and strong. Her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, and her clothes were permanently stained with hay and horsehair. But there was a satisfaction in the work that she had never found in the drawing rooms and ballrooms of her former life. The horses themselves had become her greatest comfort. Each animal had its own personality, its own quirks and preferences, and Emma had learned to read their moods and needs with an accuracy that amazed even the experienced grooms. Midnight, the Duke's prized stallion, had become particularly attached to her, whinnying softly whenever she approached his stall and nuzzling her shoulder with obvious affection. "That horse has never taken to anyone the way he's taken to you," Thomas had observed one day, watching the interaction between Emma and the valuable stallion. "His Grace is the only other person Midnight trusts completely." Emma had felt a flush of pride at the comment, even as she reminded herself to be careful about standing out too much. But she couldn't help feeling a special connection to Midnight. The horse was magnificent, intelligent, spirited, with perfect conformation and a bloodline that traced back to the finest Arabian stock. In her former life, she would have given anything to own such an animal. Now she could only love him from afar, knowing that he belonged to a man who barely knew she existed. As autumn progressed and the weather began to turn colder, Emma had settled into the rhythms of her new life. She had a small but comfortable room in the servants' quarters, plain but adequate meals in the servants' hall, and the satisfaction of work well done. It was not the life she had been born to, but it was honest work that allowed her to use her skills and maintain her independence. But on this particular October evening, as she stood watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon, Emma felt a sense of foreboding that went beyond mere concern about bad weather. The horses were more agitated than she had ever seen them, and the very air seemed charged with an energy that made her skin prickle with unease. The other stable hands had already gone to their quarters for the evening, but Emma remained, unable to shake the feeling that something momentous was approaching. The air itself seemed charged with electricity, and the usual evening sounds of the countryside had fallen into an ominous silence. Even the birds had stopped singing. Thomas Whitmore, the head groom, found her still in the stables as the first fat raindrops began to fall. He was a gruff man in his 50s who had initially been skeptical of hiring a woman, but Emma's skill with the horses had gradually won his grudging respect. "Mary," he said, using the false name she had given when she first arrived at Ravenshollow, "you should get inside. This storm's going to be a bad one." "The horses are restless," Emma replied, not taking her eyes off Midnight. "I think they know something we don't." Thomas followed her gaze to the stallion, noting the animals' obvious agitation. "Aye, they do seem unsettled, but there's nothing we can do about the weather. The stables are solid. They've weathered worse storms than this." But even as he spoke, a gust of wind rattled the stable doors with unusual force, and both humans and horses alike seemed to sense that this would be no ordinary storm. The wind was picking up now, howling through the eaves of the stable building with a sound like the voices of the damned. Emma moved from stall to stall, checking on each horse, speaking softly to calm their fears. The animals were becoming increasingly agitated, their eyes rolling white with terror as they sensed the approaching tempest. "Easy, Starlight," she murmured to one of the Duke's prized mares, a beautiful grey Arabian with a coat like spun silver. "I know you're frightened, but you're safe here. I won't let anything happen to you." The mare calmed slightly at the sound of Emma's voice, but her ears remained pricked forward, listening to sounds that human ears couldn't detect. Emma could feel the tension in the air, the electric charge that preceded the worst storms. This was going to be more than just rain and wind. This was going to be a tempest of biblical proportions. As if summoned by her thoughts, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the stable yard, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. The horses screamed in terror, rearing and kicking in their stalls, and Emma knew with sudden, terrible certainty that they were all in mortal danger. What do you think about this story so far? Are you rooting for Emma to reveal her true identity, or do you think she should keep her secret? Let us know in the comments below what you would do in her situation. The first tree fell just after midnight. Emma heard the tremendous crash as the ancient oak at the edge of the stable yard came down, its massive trunk missing the main building by mere yards. The impact sent vibrations through the ground that she could feel in her bones, and she knew that this was only the beginning. The wind was a living thing now, howling and shrieking as it tore at the stable buildings with unprecedented fury. Emma could hear timbers creaking and groaning under the assault, and she realized with growing horror that the structures that had seemed so solid and permanent might not survive this onslaught. Thomas appeared at her side, his face pale with fear. "Mary, we need to get out of here. The whole place could come down." "We can't leave the horses," Emma said firmly, her voice steady despite the terror that was growing in her chest. "They'll panic and hurt themselves if we abandon them." "Better the horses get hurt than us getting killed," Thomas replied, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. He loved these animals too, and the thought of leaving them to face the storm alone was tearing him apart. Another tremendous gust of wind struck the building, and this time they heard the ominous sound of splintering wood. Somewhere above them, part of the roof was beginning to give way under the relentless assault of wind and rain. "The Duke," Emma said suddenly, her heart clenching with worry. "Someone needs to tell the Duke what's happening." "He's in London," Thomas replied grimly. "I won't be back for 3 days. We're on our own." Emma felt her heart sink. The Duke had left that morning for business in the capital, taking his personal staff with him. The skeleton crew remaining at Ravenshollow was woefully inadequate to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. As if summoned by their conversation, one of the house servants came running through the rain, his clothes soaked and his face wild with panic. "Thomas!" he shouted over the wind. "The river's rising, the bridge is already underwater, and the lower fields are flooding. We need to move the horses to higher ground." Emma's mind raced as she processed this information. The stables were built on relatively low ground near the river, chosen for the convenience of water access and the lush pastures that surrounded them. In normal circumstances, it was an ideal location, but if the river was flooding, the entire stable complex could be underwater within hours. "Where can we take them?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that was growing in her chest. "The old stone barn on the hill," Thomas said, pointing toward the highest point of the estate. "It's the only building that's high enough and strong enough to weather this storm." Emma knew the barn he meant, a medieval structure that had been built centuries ago as a fortress against Scottish raiders. Its thick stone walls and elevated position made it virtually indestructible, but it was nearly a mile away across open countryside that was rapidly becoming a muddy swamp. "We'll never get all the horses there in time," Thomas said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Not in this weather, not with the ground turning to mud. We'd be lucky to save half of them." "Then we save the most valuable ones first," Emma said, her mind already working through the logistics. "Midnight, the breeding mares, the young stock. We can come back for the others if there's time." Thomas stared at her in amazement. "Mary, you're talking about leading horses through a hurricane across flooded ground in the middle of the night. It's suicide." "It's their only chance," Emma replied firmly. And I'm not asking anyone else to come with me, I'll take them myself. You can't handle that many horses alone, Thomas protested. Even if you could, you don't know the way to the barn in the dark. I know every inch of this estate, Emma said, and for a moment her aristocratic bearing showed through her servant's disguise. I've walked those paths 100 times. What she didn't say was that she had walked them as Lady Emma Hartwell during her visits to Ravenshollow in her previous life. The Duke had been a friend of her father's, and she had been a guest at the estate many times before her fall from grace. She knew the grounds as well as anyone, perhaps better than most. Thomas looked at her with new respect, recognizing something in her manner that he had never seen before. "Who are you really, Mary Fletcher?" he asked quietly. "I'm someone who loves these horses enough to die for them if necessary," Emma replied, avoiding his question. "Are you going to help me, or are you going to stand here arguing while they drown?" The decision was made for them when another section of roof collapsed, this time directly over the stall that housed Starlight, one of the Duke's most prized mares. The horse screamed in terror as debris rained down around her, and Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed a halter and rope and ran toward the stall, ignoring Thomas's shouts of warning. The mare was wild with panic, rearing and striking at the wreckage that had fallen into her stall. Emma approached slowly, speaking in the calm, soothing voice that had never failed to quiet even the most fractious horse. "Easy, girl," she murmured, holding out her hand for the mare to sniff. "I'm here, I'm going to get you out of this." Starlight's eyes were rolling with fear, but something in Emma's voice and manner penetrated her panic. The mare stood still long enough for Emma to slip the halter over her head and lead her out of the damaged stall. "That was incredible," Thomas breathed, staring at Emma with something approaching awe. "I've never seen anyone calm a horse that fast in a situation like this." "We don't have time to waste," Emma said, already moving toward Midnight's stall. "Help me get the others ready. We're going to save every horse in this stable if it's the last thing we do." What followed was the most harrowing night of Emma's life. Working by the light of flickering lanterns and the intermittent flashes of lightning, she and Thomas managed to halter and lead out 23 horses, every animal in the stable complex. The journey to the stone barn was a nightmare of mud, wind, and driving rain, with terrified horses balking and shying at every flash of lightning and crack of thunder. Emma led the way, her intimate knowledge of the estate's paths and her extraordinary rapport with the horses making the impossible journey merely extremely difficult. She coaxed, cajoled, and sometimes physically wrestled the animals through flooded streams and around fallen trees, her clothes soaked through and her hands bleeding from rope burns. The wind was so strong that it nearly knocked her off her feet several times, and the rain was coming down in sheets that made it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But Emma pressed on, driven by her love for these magnificent animals and her determination to save them at any cost. Midnight, the magnificent stallion who was the pride of the Duke's collection, seemed to understand that she was trying to save him. He followed her lead without question, his calm presence helping to steady the other horses as they made their treacherous way across the storm-lashed countryside. The first group of horses, the most valuable breeding stock, took nearly 2 hours to reach the safety of the stone barn. Emma was exhausted, her clothes torn and muddy, her hair plastered to her head by the driving rain. But she didn't hesitate before starting back for the second group. "Mary, you can't," Thomas protested as she prepared to venture back into the storm. "You're exhausted. Let me take the next group." "You don't know the way as well as I do," Emma said, though her voice was hoarse from shouting over the wind. "And the horses trust me. We can't afford to lose any of them now." The second trip was even more difficult than the first. The storm had intensified, if such a thing were possible, and the paths that had been merely muddy before were now running streams. Emma had to lead the horses through water that was sometimes knee-deep, feeling her way carefully to avoid holes and obstacles that could injure the animals. One of the younger horses, a 2-year-old colt named Thunder, panicked halfway to the barn and tried to bolt back toward the flooded stables. Emma managed to catch his lead rope, but the frightened animal dragged her through the mud for several yards before she could regain control. She emerged from the struggle with a gash on her forehead and a badly bruised shoulder, but she refused to give up. "Come on, Thunder," she gasped, pulling herself to her feet and speaking to the terrified colt in the same calm voice she had used with all the others. "I know you're scared, but I'm going to keep you safe. Trust me." The young horse seemed to hear something in her voice that calmed him, and he allowed her to lead him the rest of the way to the barn, without further incident. The third and final trip was the most dangerous of all. By now the stable complex was completely flooded, and Emma had to wade through chest-deep water to reach the remaining horses, The building was groaning and creaking ominously, and she knew it could collapse at any moment. The last group consisted of the older horses, animals that were past their breeding prime but still valuable and beloved. Emma refused to leave any of them behind, even though each additional minute in the flooding stables increased the risk to her own life. As she led the final group of horses out of the collapsing stables, a massive beam crashed down behind them, missing the last horse by mere inches. Emma felt her knees go weak with relief as she realized that they had all made it out alive. The journey to the barn with the final group was a test of endurance that pushed Emma beyond her limits. She was running on pure adrenaline now, her body screaming with exhaustion and pain, but she refused to give in. These horses depended on her, and she would not let them down. When she finally led the last horse into the safety of the stone barn, Emma collapsed against the ancient stone wall, her strength completely spent. Every horse was safe. Every precious life had been preserved. The Duke's breeding program, his life's work, his passion, all of it had been saved by the courage and determination of a woman he barely knew existed. Thomas stared at her in amazement and admiration. "Mary," he said quietly, "what you did tonight, it was a miracle. I've never seen anything like it." Emma managed a weak smile. "They're safe," she whispered. "That's all that matters." As dawn broke over the flooded estate, Emma looked out at the devastation and wondered what would happen when the Duke returned. Would he even realize what she had done? Would he care that a mere stable hand had risked her life to save his horses? She had no way of knowing that Adrian Blackwood was already racing back from London, having received word of the storm's devastation. She had no idea that he was sick with worry about his horses, fearing that he had lost everything he cared about most in the world, and she certainly couldn't have imagined that when he finally arrived at Ravenshollow and learned what had happened, he would look at his humble stable hand with new eyes and see not just a servant but a miracle. The revelation. The Duke of Ravenshollow arrived at his estate 3 days after the storm, his face grim with anticipation of the worst. The reports he had received in London were fragmentary and contradictory. Some spoke of complete devastation, others of miraculous salvation. All he knew for certain was that the greatest storm in living memory had struck Yorkshire, and that his beloved horses had been directly in its path. Adrian Blackwood had built his life around those horses. They were more than valuable assets or symbols of his wealth. They were his passion, his legacy, the living embodiment of everything he hoped to achieve. The breeding program he had spent years developing represented not just financial investment, but emotional commitment that went to the very core of his being. His love for horses had begun in childhood, when his father had first lifted him onto the back of a gentle mare and taught him to ride. The late Duke had been a horseman of considerable skill, but it was Adrian who had inherited the true passion for breeding and bloodlines. He had studied the great Arabian horses of the desert, traveled to distant lands to acquire the finest stock, and devoted his considerable resources to creating what many considered the finest stable in England. The thought of losing them was almost unbearable, but he had steeled himself for the worst during the long, anxious journey from London. He had cut short important business meetings, ignored the protests of his solicitors and advisors, and driven his horses mercilessly through the night to reach Ravenshollow as quickly as possible. What he found when he arrived at his estate defied all his expectations. The lower portions of his estate were indeed devastated. The stable complex where his horses had lived was completely destroyed, reduced to scattered timbers and debris by the combined forces of wind and flood. The carefully manicured paddocks were scarred with fallen trees and deep gullies carved by rushing water. The damage was extensive and would take months to repair, but his horses, his precious, irreplaceable horses, were alive and well in the old stone barn on the hill. Thomas Whitmore met the Duke as his carriage pulled up to the main house, the head groom's face bearing an expression of wonder that Adrian had never seen before. The usually stoic man seemed almost overwhelmed with emotion, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your Grace," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "I hardly know where to begin. The storm was like nothing I've ever seen. We thought we'd lost everything. But the horses," Adrian asked urgently, his heart pounding with fear and hope in equal measure. "Tell me about the horses, Thomas." "Safe, Your Grace. Every last one of them. Not a single animal lost, not even a serious injury among them." Adrian stared at his head groom in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "How is that possible? The reports I received said the stables were completely destroyed." "They were, Your Grace, completely underwater by morning. But we got the horses out before the worst of it hit. Moved them all to the old stone barn on the hill." "All of them?" Adrian's voice was barely a whisper. Even Midnight. Especially Midnight, Your Grace. He's fine. They're all fine. It's a miracle, nothing less. Adrian felt his knees go weak with relief. His horses were safe. The breeding program he had spent years developing, the bloodlines he had carefully cultivated, the dreams he had invested in these magnificent animals, all of it had been preserved. "Thomas," he said, his voice unsteady with emotion, "how did you manage it? How did you get 23 horses to safety in the middle of a hurricane?" The head groom's expression grew thoughtful, almost reverent. "It wasn't me, Your Grace, it was Mary Fletcher. That girl, she's something special. I've never seen anything like what she did that night." "Mary Fletcher," Adrian frowned, trying to place the name. He knew all his horses by name, could recite their bloodlines and breeding records from memory, but the stable hands were largely anonymous to him, hard-working people who did their jobs competently but without distinction. "One of the stable hands, Your Grace. Been with us about 6 months. Quiet girl, keeps to herself, but she has a way with horses that's, well, it's almost supernatural." Adrian's frown deepened. He prided himself on knowing everyone who worked with his horses, yet he couldn't recall this Mary Fletcher clearly. There had been a new girl, he remembered vaguely, someone Thomas had hired to replace one of the grooms who had left for a position closer to his family, but she had remained in the background during his visits to the stables, and he had paid her little attention. "Tell me exactly what happened, Thomas. I want to know everything." What followed was a tale that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Thomas described how Mary Fletcher had recognized the danger before anyone else, how she had refused to abandon the horses even when the stable roof was collapsing around them, how she had led group after group of terrified animals through the storm to safety. She knew every path, Your Grace, even in the dark and the rain, never hesitated, never lost her way. And the horses, they followed her like she was their mother. Even Midnight, who's never taken to anyone but you, followed her without question. "She made 3 trips?" Adrian asked, his amazement growing with every detail. 3 trips through the worst storm I've ever seen, Your Grace. The wind was strong enough to knock a man down, the rain was coming down in sheets, and the ground was turning to mud. But she kept going back until every horse was safe. Adrian felt a strange stirring in his chest, part gratitude, part curiosity, part something else he couldn't quite identify. This Mary Fletcher, this servant he barely remembered, had saved everything he held dear. She had risked her life for his horses, shown courage and skill that would have been remarkable in anyone, let alone a stable hand. "Where is she now?" Adrian asked, his curiosity growing with every word of Thomas's account. "Still up at the barn with the horses, Your Grace. She's barely left their side since the storm. Says she wants to make sure they're all right, that they're not suffering from the trauma of what they went through." Adrian felt his respect for this unknown woman growing. Not only had she saved his horses, but she was continuing to care for them, ensuring their well-being even after the immediate danger had passed. This was not the behavior of someone simply doing her job. This was the action of someone who genuinely loved these animals. "I want to see her," he said. "I want to thank her personally for what she's done." "Of course, Your Grace. She'll be honored by your attention." But as they made their way up the hill to the stone barn, Adrian found himself wondering about this mysterious woman who had performed such an extraordinary feat. What kind of person risked their life for animals that weren't even their own? What drove someone to show such courage, such dedication, such skill? The old stone barn was a relic from a more violent age, built in the 13th century as a refuge during border raids. Its thick walls and elevated position had made it virtually impregnable to medieval attackers, and those same qualities had made it the perfect shelter from the modern storm. Adrian could hear the horses before he saw them, the familiar sounds of animals at peace, munching hay and moving quietly in their temporary stalls. The scene that greeted him inside the barn was one he would remember for the rest of his life. The space had been transformed into a makeshift stable, with temporary stalls created from whatever materials could be found. Fresh straw covered the floor, water troughs had been improvised from barrels and buckets, and hay was stacked neatly along the walls. It was crude compared to the sophisticated facilities the horses were accustomed to, but it was clean, dry, and safe. And in the center of it all was Mary Fletcher. Adrian's breath caught in his throat as he saw her for the first time. Really saw her, not as a faceless servant, but as an individual. She was kneeling beside Midnight, running her hands over the stallion's legs with the practiced touch of someone who understood equine anatomy intimately. Her clothes were simple and practical, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, but there was something about her bearing, her grace, her obvious competence that set her apart. Even in her humble servant's attire, There was an elegance to her movements that spoke of breeding and education. The way she handled the horses showed not just skill but an intuitive understanding that went beyond mere training. And when she looked up as they entered, Adrian found himself staring into the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen, deep green, intelligent, and filled with a warmth that seemed to light up the dim interior of the barn. For a moment neither of them spoke, caught in a moment of mutual recognition that went deeper than words. Adrian felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that this was no ordinary servant, no simple, stable hand. There was mystery here, depth, a story that went far beyond what appeared on the surface. "Mary," Thomas said, breaking the spell, "His Grace has come to see the horses." "And to thank you for what you did." Emma rose gracefully to her feet, her heart pounding as she faced the man she had admired from afar for so long. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the moment when the Duke would finally notice her, when her carefully maintained anonymity would be shattered. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy that was perhaps a bit too elegant for a stable hand. "I'm so glad you've returned safely." Adrian stared at her, his mind reeling. There was something about this woman that didn't fit, something that nagged at the edges of his consciousness. Her voice was cultured, her manner refined despite her humble clothes. And those eyes, he felt as though he had seen them somewhere before. "Miss Fletcher," he said, his voice formal but warm, "I understand I owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. Thomas tells me you saved my horses." "I did what anyone would have done in my position, Your Grace," Emma replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "The horses needed help and I was able to provide it." "Anyone would have done it?" Adrian shook his head. "Miss Fletcher, what you did was extraordinary. You risked your life to save animals that don't even belong to you. That kind of courage, that kind of dedication, it's remarkable." Emma felt her cheeks flush under his intense gaze. "The horses are remarkable creatures, Your Grace. They deserve to be saved." "Tell me," Adrian said, moving closer to her, "how did you know the way to this barn in the dark? Thomas says you never hesitated, never lost your way." Emma's heart raced as she realized the danger of the question. How could she explain her intimate knowledge of the estate without revealing her true identity? I've explored the estate during my time off, Your Grace," she said carefully. "I enjoy walking, and I've always been drawn to old buildings like this one." It wasn't entirely a lie, though it wasn't the complete truth either. She had indeed explored every inch of Ravenshollow, but as Lady Emma Hartwell, not as Mary Fletcher. Adrian studied her face, noting the slight hesitation in her answer. There was something she wasn't telling him, something important. But before he could pursue the matter further, Midnight whinnied softly and moved toward Emma, nuzzling her shoulder with obvious affection. "Extraordinary," Adrian breathed, watching the interaction between his prized stallion and this mysterious woman. "Midnight has never shown such trust in anyone except me. How did you win him over so completely?" Emma smiled, her face lighting up with genuine joy as she stroked the horse's neck. "He's a magnificent animal, Your Grace. Intelligent, noble, with a spirit that can't be broken. I think he simply recognized that I wanted to help him." "You know horses," Adrian said, and it wasn't a question. "Really know them. That's not something you learn from mucking stalls." Emma's pulse quickened. She was walking a dangerous line, revealing too much of her knowledge while trying to maintain her disguise. "My father worked with horses, Your Grace. He taught me what he knew before he died." Again, not entirely a lie. The Earl of Thornfield had indeed taught her about horses, though he had been her father, not the father of a stable hand. "Your father must have been an exceptional horseman," Adrian said thoughtfully. "The way you handle these animals, the way they respond to you, it's almost as if you were born to it." "Perhaps I was, Your Grace," Emma said softly, and for a moment her guard slipped, allowing him to see the depth of her passion for these magnificent creatures. Adrian felt something shift inside his chest as he looked at her. This was no ordinary servant, no simple stable hand. There was mystery here, depth, a story that went far beyond what she was telling him, and there was something else, a growing attraction that he couldn't deny, despite the vast gulf in their social positions. "Miss Fletcher," he said, his voice gentler than before, "I want you to know that what you did will not go unrewarded. You saved not just my horses, but my life's work. I am in your debt." "You owe me nothing, Your Grace," Emma said firmly. "I did what I felt was right. That's reward enough." "Nevertheless," Adrian insisted, "I want to do something for you. A promotion, perhaps, or a substantial bonus. Name your price." Emma shook her head, her green eyes serious. "Truly, Your Grace, I need nothing more than I have. The privilege of caring for these magnificent animals is payment enough. Adrian stared at her in amazement. In his experience, everyone had a price, everyone wanted something. Yet here was a woman who had risked her life for his horses and wanted nothing in return except the right to continue caring for them. "You're remarkable," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Emma felt her breath catch at the warmth in his voice, at the way he was looking at her, as though she were something precious rather than merely useful. For a moment, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve, and she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if things were different, if she were still Lady Emma Hartwell and free to respond to the obvious attraction in his eyes. But reality intruded quickly, reminding her of her precarious position. She was a servant now, dependent on his goodwill for her very survival. Any hint of impropriety, any suggestion that she was overstepping her bounds, could result in her dismissal and ruin. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, stepping back and lowering her eyes. "That's very kind of you to say." Adrian sensed her withdrawal and felt a pang of loss. For a moment, he had seen something in her eyes that had made his heart race, a warmth, an intelligence, a connection that went beyond the usual interactions between master and servant. But now she was retreating behind the safe barriers of her position, and he found himself wanting to call her back. "Miss Fletcher," he said impulsively, would you consider taking on additional responsibilities? Overseeing the rebuilding of the stables, perhaps, or helping to plan the new facilities?" Emma looked up in surprise. "Your Grace, I'm honored by your confidence, but surely you have more qualified people for such important work." "Do I?" Adrian challenged. "You've just proven that you understand these horses better than anyone else on my staff. You know what they need, what will keep them safe and comfortable. Who better to help design their new home?" Emma felt torn between excitement and terror. The opportunity to help design new stables, to put her knowledge and passion to use in such a meaningful way, was everything she had ever dreamed of. But it would also mean working closely with the Duke, spending time in his company, risking exposure of her true identity and her growing feelings for him. I would be honored to help in any way I can, Your Grace," she said finally, her love for the horses overriding her caution. "Excellent," Adrian said, his face lighting up with a smile that made Emma's heart skip a beat. "We'll begin planning immediately. I want the new stables to be the finest in England, worthy of the horses you saved." As they talked about plans and possibilities, Emma found herself forgetting to be careful, forgetting to maintain the humble demeanor of a servant. Her knowledge and passion shone through, and she spoke with the authority and expertise of someone who had been born to this life. Adrian listened with growing fascination, noting the depth of her understanding, the sophistication of her ideas, the way she spoke about breeding programs and bloodlines with the expertise of a professional. This was no ordinary stable hand. This was someone with education, experience, and a knowledge of horses that rivaled his own. "Miss Fletcher," he said finally, "I have to ask, where did you really learn so much about horses? Your knowledge goes far beyond what any stable hand would possess." Emma felt panic rise in her throat. She had revealed too much, allowed her passion to override her caution. Now she was faced with a direct question that she couldn't answer without lying outright or revealing her true identity. My father was very knowledgeable, Your Grace," she said weakly. "He taught me everything he knew." "Your father must have been extraordinary," Adrian said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me about him. Where did he work? Who did he learn from?" Emma felt trapped, caught between the truth she couldn't tell and lies she didn't want to speak. In that moment of crisis, she made a decision that would change everything. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "there are things about my past that I cannot discuss. I hope you will respect that and judge me only by my actions, not by my history." Adrian stared at her, recognizing the dignity in her refusal to lie and the courage it took to make such a statement to a man who held her livelihood in his hands. There was mystery here, secrets that went deep, but he found himself respecting her honesty even as his curiosity grew. "Very well, Miss Fletcher," he said finally, "I will judge you by your actions. And your actions have shown you to be a woman of extraordinary courage, skill, and integrity." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at his words. In her former life, she had been praised for her beauty, her accomplishments, her social graces, but never had anyone recognized the qualities that truly mattered to her: her courage, her integrity, her deep love for the animals in her care. "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered. "That means more to me than you could possibly know." As they stood there in the ancient barn, surrounded by the horses she had saved and the man she had come to love, Emma realized that her life had reached a turning point. She could continue to hide behind her false identity, safe but forever separated from the man who was beginning to see her as she truly was, or she could find the courage to reveal the truth and risk everything for the chance at something real. The storm had passed, but Emma sensed that an even greater tempest was approaching, one that would test not just her courage, but her heart. The truth revealed. In the weeks that followed the storm, Emma found herself working more closely with the Duke than she had ever imagined possible. The rebuilding of the stables became a joint project, with Adrian seeking her input on every detail from the placement of windows to the design of the paddocks. Their daily meetings became the highlight of Emma's existence, even as they tortured her with their impossibility. The new stable complex would be a marvel of modern engineering, incorporating everything they had learned from the destruction of the old buildings. Emma's suggestions were innovative and practical. Elevated foundations to protect against flooding, reinforced roofing to withstand high winds, improved ventilation systems to ensure the horses' health and comfort. The stalls should be larger, Emma said one morning as they reviewed the architect's plans. These magnificent animals need space to move freely, especially during confinement. Agreed, Adrian said, making notes on the drawings. And your idea about the covered walkways between buildings is excellent. It will allow us to move the horses safely even in bad weather. Their collaboration was seamless, their shared passion for the horses creating a bond that transcended the artificial barriers of their supposed social positions. Adrian found himself looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that went far beyond professional interest, while Emma struggled daily with the growing deception that lay at the heart of their relationship. Adrian, for his part, found himself increasingly fascinated by his mysterious stable hand. Mary Fletcher was unlike anyone he had ever met, intelligent, passionate, and possessed of a knowledge of horses that seemed almost intuitive. More than that, she challenged him intellectually in ways that no woman of his acquaintance ever had. Their discussions about stable design evolved into conversations about breeding theory, bloodlines, and the future of equine husbandry that left him energized and eager for their next meeting. But it was more than her mind that attracted him. There was something about Mary Fletcher that called to him on a deeper level, a grace in her movements, a refinement in her speech, a depth in her green eyes that suggested hidden depths and untold stories. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering about her past, imagining what it would be like to know her completely. The attraction was dangerous and inappropriate, and Adrian knew it. She was his employee, dependent on him for her livelihood, and any romantic entanglement would be a gross abuse of his power. Yet he couldn't seem to help himself. Every day brought new evidence of her remarkable character, new reasons to admire and desire her. Emma was fighting the same battle from the other side. Working so closely with Adrian, seeing his passion for his horses, his fairness in dealing with his employees, his genuine kindness beneath his aristocratic reserve, only deepened her feelings for him. She found herself treasuring every smile, every moment of shared laughter, every instance when he looked at her with something warmer than professional respect. But she was also acutely aware of the deception that lay at the heart of their relationship. Every day she spent as Mary Fletcher was another day of lies, another betrayal of the trust he was placing in her. She told herself that her false identity protected them both, him from the scandal of being attracted to a disgraced noblewoman, her from the consequences of her stepmother's machinations. But the guilt was eating away at her, making every moment of happiness feel stolen and undeserved. The crisis came on a crisp November morning when Adrian arrived at the barn to find Emma in tears, clutching a letter that had arrived with the morning post. She tried to compose herself when she saw him, hastily wiping her eyes and attempting to fold the letter away, but the distress was too great to hide completely. "Mary," he said, his voice filled with concern as he approached her. "What's wrong? What's happened?" Emma looked up at him with eyes red from crying, and for a moment she was tempted to tell him everything, her real identity, her feelings for him, the impossible situation that trapped them both. But fear held her back, fear of losing the life she had built, fear of his reaction when he learned how thoroughly she had deceived him. "It's nothing, Your Grace," she said, trying to fold the letter away. "Just personal matters." But Adrian had seen enough to recognize the quality of the paper, the elegant handwriting, the expensive seal. This was not a letter to a stable hand from her family or friends. This was correspondence from someone of wealth and position, written on paper that cost more than most servants earned in a week. "Mary," he said gently, moving closer to her, "I can see that you're upset. If there's anything I can do to help. Emma shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. The letter was from her stepmother's solicitor, informing her that Constance had died suddenly from the same fever that had claimed her father, and that, as the Earl's only legitimate child, Emma was now the rightful heir to the Thornfield estate. All of her stepmother's machinations had been for nothing. The altered will had been contested by distant relatives who had uncovered evidence of coercion, and Emma's inheritance had been restored. It was everything she had thought she wanted: vindication, restoration of her rightful position, freedom from the deception that had consumed her life. The letter detailed vast holdings, substantial income, and the return of the very horses and breeding program that had been stolen from her. She could reclaim her title, her wealth, her place in society, but all she could think about was that it meant leaving Ravenshollow, leaving the horses she had come to love, leaving Adrian just when their relationship was beginning to deepen into something that might have been wonderful. "Mary," Adrian said, moving closer to her, his voice gentle but insistent, "please let me help. Whatever it is, we can face it together." The kindness in his voice was her undoing. Emma looked up at him, this man she had come to love beyond reason, and made a decision that terrified and liberated her in equal measure. "Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion, "there's something I need to tell you, something about who I really am." Adrian felt his heart begin to race. He had known from the beginning that there was more to Mary Fletcher than met the eye, but he had never pressed for details, respecting her obvious desire for privacy. Now, seeing the pain and fear in her eyes, he realized that whatever she was about to tell him would change everything between them. "You can tell me anything," he said softly, reaching out to take her hands in his. "I promise you that." Emma took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what might be the most important conversation of her life. "My name is not Mary Fletcher," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's Emma, Lady Emma Hartwell, daughter of the late Earl of Thornfield." Adrian stared at her in shock, his mind reeling as the pieces suddenly fell into place. Lady Emma Hartwell. He remembered her now, remembered meeting her at various social functions, remembered thinking that she was one of the most intelligent and accomplished young women of his acquaintance. He had wondered what had become of her after her father's death, when she had seemed to disappear from society entirely. "Emma," he said, testing her real name on his lips. "Lady Emma Hartwell. But why are you here working as a stable hand?" Emma told him everything then. Her father's death, her stepmother's betrayal, the forced engagement she had fled, the desperate decision to create a new identity and start over. She spoke of the months of loneliness and hard work, of the fear of discovery, of the growing love for the horses, and for him that had made her deception both necessary and unbearable. "I created the identity of Mary Fletcher because I had no choice," she explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I couldn't marry Lord Blackthorne. He was a cruel man who would have destroyed everything I loved about horses and breeding. I couldn't live under my stepmother's control, being used as a pawn in her schemes. So I ran, and I've been hiding here ever since." "You've been working as a servant," Adrian said wonderfully, "when you should have been living as the lady you were born to be." "I've been living as myself," Emma corrected firmly. "For the first time in my life, I've been free to make my own choices, to work with horses because I love them, not because it's expected of me. Yes, it's been hard, but it's been honest." Adrian listened to her confession with a mixture of amazement, admiration, and growing understanding. Everything about Mary Fletcher, Emma, that had puzzled him now made perfect sense. Her knowledge of horses, her refined manner, her obvious education, her intimate familiarity with his estate, all of it fit with her true identity as the daughter of an earl who had been known for his exceptional stables. "I know I should have told you sooner," Emma continued, tears flowing freely now. "I know I've betrayed your trust, deceived you in the worst possible way. I'll understand if you want me to leave immediately." "Leave?" Adrian said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Emma, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, expecting to see anger, disappointment, disgust. Instead, she saw something that made her heart stop. Wonder, admiration, and unmistakable love. "How you incredible, brave, foolish woman," he said softly, his hands tightening on hers. "Do you have any idea what you've put yourself through? What you've sacrificed?" "I had no choice," Emma said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't marry that horrible man, couldn't live under my stepmother's control. I had to be free even if it meant giving up everything else. Including your rightful place in society," Adrian said, his voice filled with awe. "Including comfort, security, the life you were born to live. You gave up everything for your principles. None of that mattered, Emma said fiercely. Not compared to my freedom, my right to choose my own path. I would rather muck stalls for the rest of my life than live as a prisoner in a gilded cage. Adrian felt his heart swell with love and admiration for this extraordinary woman. She had given up everything, title, wealth, position, rather than submit to a life she couldn't accept. She had worked with her hands, lived in servants' quarters, endured hardships that would have broken most people of her background, all for the sake of her independence and integrity. "And you chose to save my horses," he said wonderfully. "You risked your life for them, even though you had no obligation to do so, even though revealing your true skills might have exposed your identity." "I love them," Emma said simply. "I couldn't bear to see them suffer, and She hesitated, then forged ahead with the same courage that had carried her through the storm. "I love you. I've loved you for months, even though I knew it was hopeless, even though I knew I could never tell you. And I love you," Adrian said, the words coming out in a rush of emotion. "I love your courage, your integrity, your passion for life. I love the woman you are, whether you're Lady Emma Hartwell or Mary Fletcher, or anyone else you choose to be." Emma stared at him in amazement, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Adrian, you can't mean that. I'm a fraud, a liar. I've deceived you for months." "You're a woman who did what she had to do to survive," Adrian corrected firmly. "You're a woman who chose freedom over comfort, integrity over security. You're a woman who saved the things I love most in this world, and in doing so you saved me." He moved closer to her, his eyes never leaving her face. "Emma, I've been falling in love with you for weeks, not knowing who you really were. Now that I do know, I love you even more. You're everything I never dared to hope for in a woman. Intelligent, brave, passionate, real." "But the scandal," Emma protested weakly. "When people learned that I worked as a servant, that I deceived everyone." "Let them talk," Adrian said dismissively. "Emma, you're the daughter of an earl, the rightful heir to a substantial estate. You have nothing to be ashamed of. And if anyone dares to criticize you for having the courage to forge your own path, they'll answer to me." "The letter," Emma said suddenly, remembering the correspondence that had started this conversation. "My stepmother is dead. The solicitor says I've inherited everything, Thornfield, the horses, all of it. I could go back, reclaim my old life. Is that what you want?" Adrian asked, though his heart clenched at the thought of losing her. Emma looked around the barn, at the horses they had saved together, at the man who had come to mean everything to her. "No," she said firmly. "That life was never really mine. It was what others expected of me. This life, working with horses, being with you, this is what I choose." "Emma," Adrian whispered, his heart overflowing with love and hope. "But I want to be honest about who I am," she continued. "No more deception, no more lies. If we're going to build something together, it has to be based on truth." "Then marry me," Adrian said, taking her hands in his and dropping to one knee right there in the stable. "Not because you need my protection or my position, but because you love me as much as I love you. Marry me and help me build the finest horse breeding program in England. Marry me and be my partner in everything." Emma looked down at him, this powerful duke kneeling in the straw of a stable, proposing to a woman who had worked as his servant, and felt her heart overflow with joy. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear despite her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you, Adrian. I've loved you for so long, and I never thought—" He rose and silenced her with a kiss that was everything she had dreamed of and more, passionate, tender, full of promise for the future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and laughing with joy. "The horses," Emma said suddenly, looking around at the animals that had brought them together. "What will people say when they learn that the Duke of Ravenshollow fell in love with his stable hand?" "They'll say that I'm the luckiest man in England," Adrian replied firmly, "and they'll be absolutely right. And when they learn that I'm actually Lady Emma Hartwell, who worked as a servant to escape an unwanted marriage, they'll say that you're the bravest woman in England," Adrian said with conviction. "And they'll be right about that too." Emma laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "We'll combine our breeding programs," she said excitedly. "Thornfield has some excellent bloodlines that would complement your Arabian stock perfectly." "Our breeding programs," Adrian corrected with a smile. "Everything I have will be yours, just as everything you have will be mine. We'll build something magnificent together." As they stood together in the barn where Emma had saved his horses, and unknowingly his heart, Adrian marveled at the strange turns that fate could take. He had thought the storm had been a disaster, a catastrophe that threatened everything he held dear. Instead, It had been the catalyst that brought him the greatest treasure of his life, a woman whose courage and love had transformed his understanding of what truly mattered. The other horses seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere, nickering softly and moving restlessly in their stalls. Midnight approached them, nuzzling Emma's shoulder with obvious approval, as if he understood that his two favorite humans had finally found their way to each other. "Even the horses approve," Adrian said with a laugh. "They always knew," Emma said, stroking Midnight's neck. "Animals have an instinct for these things. They could sense the connection between us long before we acknowledged it ourselves." "Speaking of acknowledgement," Adrian said, his expression growing serious, "we should discuss how to handle the revelation of your true identity. There will be questions, gossip, perhaps some criticism." "I'm not afraid of gossip," Emma said firmly. "I've lived through worse than anything society can dish out. Besides, the truth is on our side. I'm the legitimate daughter of an earl. I've inherited my rightful estate, and I've done nothing shameful." "Working as a servant isn't shameful," Adrian agreed, "but some people will see it as scandalous for a woman of your birth." "Then those people have very limited imaginations," Emma replied with spirit. "I chose honest work over a dishonest marriage. I chose independence over security. I chose love over convention. I'm proud of every choice I've made." Adrian's admiration for her grew even stronger. "You're remarkable," he said softly. "I can't wait to introduce you to society as my Duchess." "Your Duchess," Emma repeated wonderfully. "It still doesn't seem real." "It's real," Adrian assured her, pulling her close again. "And it's going to be wonderful. We'll rebuild the stables together, combine our breeding programs, and create something that will be the envy of horsemen throughout Europe. And we'll do it as equals," Emma said, looking up at him with shining eyes. "Partners in every sense of the word." "Partners," Adrian agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. As the sun set over Ravenshollow, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Emma reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything: family, fortune, position, only to find something far more valuable: true love, genuine partnership, and the freedom to be herself completely. The storm had indeed changed everything, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. It had stripped away the artificial barriers that separated them, revealed the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of deception and social convention, and brought two hearts together in a love that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. Emma Hartwell had saved the Duke's horses during the storm, but she had done something far more important than that. She had saved his heart, his soul, his capacity for the kind of deep, transformative love that he had never believed possible. And in return, he had given her the greatest gift of all: the freedom to be herself completely and without reservation, in a partnership built on mutual respect, shared passion, and unconditional love. The miracle wasn't just that the horses had survived the storm. It was that two people, who seemed destined to remain forever separated by the rigid boundaries of society, had found their way to each other, creating a love story that would be remembered long after the last echoes of thunder had faded away. If this tale of hidden identity and unexpected love, where a storm became the catalyst for a romance that defied all social conventions, has swept you away, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more captivating historical romances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Emma was right to hide her identity, or should she have revealed the truth sooner? What would you have done in her situation? Your engagement helps us continue bringing you stories where true love conquers all obstacles and proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. Thank you for joining us in this tale of courage and redemption, and until our next romantic adventure unfolds, remember that real nobility comes not from birth, but from the courage to risk everything for those we love.